After a lot of experience with the self-improvement movement, I've come to the conclusion that the presence of it online, particularly on Twitter and on YouTube, and to a lesser extent in other places, is that as a whole, that whole group, including the manosphere generally, and a lot of other sort of manosphere adjacent people, I think that the whole movement can kind of be likened to an apricot if you were to swallow it whole. You have the flesh that is sweet, at least initially, and it provides a lot of information that is going to seem to be superficially very useful. But the trouble is that there are a lot of very deep problems with the movement, and that's where the stone comes in. You choke on the stone if you eat the apricot whole. And so, as somebody who produced content in this community for quite a while, and as somebody who knew some people involved in it, maybe not to the extent that I could have been involved, but still nonetheless there, I think it would be a good video to produce some content describing how exactly I got involved, what kind of stuff was in the movement, and also trying to address, to be honest, the spiritual problems with the movement. Because the majority of the people involved, although a lot of them aren't aware of it and don't know better, in fact, I'm pretty sure 90% of them don't know better, it's spiritually corrupt. It's a place which takes people who are resentful and which takes people who have been dealt kind of a hard hand in life. Maybe they don't have a father, maybe there was divorce very young, maybe they have other resentment of women and stuff like that, and it gets them into this myopic mindset, pursuing the wrong goods, things that won't satisfy them, and telling them falsehoods. So I'm going to talk about my time in that movement and the content that I made, and specifically the motivations for which I made that content, and then I'm going to give specific pointed advice. So this video is aimed at two kinds of people. It's aimed at people who are in the situation I've just described. You're unhappy. Your parents have got divorced, you're poor, you have Asperger's or autism or something like this, and you want to just improve. That's the first and foremost. And the second one, and I think it's going to be more useful for them if they actually pay attention, is for the actual self-improvement YouTubers themselves. Because there are a lot of disorders that I see with these YouTubers, and I think that I can provide somewhat of a remedy, particularly if they have the patience to read. And it's the same for the first group. So I'm going to have a first section where I'm going to talk about my life and how I got involved and all of that. And that's going to have some advice here and there. But it's mostly sort of background for the second part, which is going to be about where are the errors, where are the mistakes, where are the disorders, and how are we supposed to address them and live happy lives? Because nobody tries to improve their life unless they want it to be, in some sense, better, or to live a good life. And we need to analyze what our lives actually are in order to really reach this conclusion. So without further ado, we'll talk about that now. So I'm going to begin the story in 2016, which, for those who are watching, in the future, is about 5 years ago at this point. And I just entered university, and I found that my childhood, in whatever way, hadn't really set me up with wisdom about the world. I found that the school system wasn't that great, although I went to a pretty good school, and I realised I didn't really know much. But one thing that I did realise is that I really, 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 really did not like SJWs. For those who don't know, social justice warriors. Actually, I think almost all of you do, so I'm just going to leave it at that. And going through university, I realised that of course I just said I didn't know anything. I was in an environment that was not especially familiar. I'd lived at home for my entire life with just family. And I wanted to learn. I wanted to get an idea of how life was. Like, I hadn't had a girlfriend or anything at that point. I went and looked. I tried to find the normal. I never found the normal. I went and just read about, read philosophers. I went and read Machiavelli, someone I wouldn't really recommend. I read Plato. I read other people. And I also made political content on YouTube against SJWs. And this actually attracted a lot of people who were Christian. I remember actually one of the first things I did with YouTube while I was at university is that I stayed up until 7 in the morning talking to a particular, at that point, Protestant YouTuber called Fritz Imperial, and we ended up just talking away, and I found someone that I really liked. And as I started to dig into their traditions, because to be honest, I think like a lot of the people watching, they just think, oh, those Christians, they're just kind of stupid. They're backwaters people. Maybe they think they're bigots if they're, maybe coming from X Red Pill or something like that. But I actually discovered an extremely rich, like completely dwarfs the Enlightenment. This extremely rich intellectual tradition, and I developed in that, and eventually, I'm at the conclusion that you can't reasonably deny God if you actually know what God is. But this is important because it's going to explain where I went from here. Because I'm building up this wisdom over time, and this goes for about 2.5 years. And I'm at university doing very university things, going to nightclubs, getting drunk. Not really, maybe not to the extent of some people, but you still know nonetheless, living a dissolute life, despite maybe what I believe, because I converted to Catholicism in 2017. And so I was seeking wisdom, I was seeking knowledge, I was seeking how to actually establish my life, which wasn't that great. I wasn't, it wasn't always the most provided for intellectually childhood. And by that I mean, I didn't know how to live a good life, I didn't know how to be good. Because I always believed in good. And so, eventually, after some time, I stumbled across YouTube self-improvement people. And I eventually came across someone who was quite big. Now, I'm not going to name people in this video because I don't think that this is I don't think that it's really appropriate. I don't think it's going to help. So I'll call the guy that I met, I'll call him Crassus. So I became friends with Crassus. And things developed, and we were good friends. And he did a lot of good for me. And he started, I started watching his content. And I started reading content of other people on Twitter and on YouTube, and just getting into this mindset. And it didn't help that I was, to be honest, very unhappy because I didn't have a girlfriend at that point. I thought that you needed such a thing to be, maybe not to be happy, but I felt the lack. I was overweight to a large extent, and I think you can probably tell I still am. To some extent, not as much as I was maybe then. I was dealing with a course that was soul-crushing, to be honest, and very depressing. I was around people who were very depressed. And so I started getting into the content, getting into the YouTube circles, and even getting into arguments and debates with different people in the field. And this went on for about 2.5 years. And fast forward, I got a job for a year in industry. And eventually I lost that job because I was ill. And so I found myself in a situation where I wasn't financially very well off. I wasn't making the money, I wasn't bringing money in. Thank God that I'd read some of the financial self-improvement stuff, and so that kind of saved me. And so I eventually decided that I would pick a niche in the self-improvement people and make a channel, because I knew that it could be very, very profitable. I knew of a person who was making $15,000 a month off of this, just making, self-improvement videos. And so I did so. And my principal observation was this. It's that I'd started reading the Bible at this point, because before I kind of had maybe a low view of Scripture. I thought that Scripture was just one of those things that Protestants read, and that, really smart people read the Fathers. And I was reading through the Twitter, and I was reading through the Scriptures, and I was discovering, almost all of these, outside of specific technical niches, almost all of these YouTubers, they're only repeating about the same 20% of Proverbs, and it's not even very good, because there's a lot of toxic error in there as well. I didn't think quite so harshly as I do now about it, but there was a lot of error mixed in, and there was a lot of resentment. And so I thought, well, I'd like to learn more about, the Fathers, like I've said, who are, for those who don't know, the Fathers are very early Christian writers. And also from, these wise men that had lived for about, the 2,000 years since Christ, mostly. A lot of these were in the first 1,000 years, though. And so I decided to start up a YouTube channel, for those who don't know, called Renaissance Man. And what I did was I would make videos on a set schedule, and I had a paywall where I would record audiobooks, sometimes I wasn't so good with the copyright. In hindsight, actually, I'm not really sure with that one because I'm thinking about a specific one that was written in the 20s, but I don't know about the translation. I'd record these audiobooks, mostly definitely fine. Some of them I'm not quite clear now. Either way, they're off the web. And I would record advice videos behind this paywall as well. And I made this content just trying to make it distinct from the self-improvement YouTubers, trying to provide a different perspective, and frankly, trying to provide better wisdom than the other people could offer. Because frankly, a lot of it was very repetitive. We'll get onto that in a minute. And so I did this for about, I'd say about a little under a year, at least as a profit-making venture. And eventually, what happened is I got into some trouble with some women I was living with, and I ended up getting thrown out of the house. And then it all kind of plummeted. I was making a pretty decent amount of money this way. I was making enough to pay my rent and utilities at the very least. So, you know, the self-improvement stuff is very, very, it can be very lucrative. The problem I have is that it's lucrative for the wrong reasons, as we'll get on to. But I didn't, although I'd stopped doing the YouTube quite so intensely as I was before, I still did, streams, and I was still reading, and I read more and more and more and more and more, and building up, wisdom. In a very, very, book learny kind of way, and also some experience, not all that much. And as I developed, I sort of distanced myself more from the. I deleted my Twitter account eventually because all I would do is I'd go on there and I'd get angry. And I sort of distanced myself from that kind of community. And while I still thought around in a similar kind of way, I largely thought that it was kind of bad. In fact, I had friends that were warning me, like, Elliot, these people are bad. What they're teaching, and I was. I kind of acknowledged it, but I sort of tolerated it because, I'm making money. Eventually, obviously, that dropped down, and now I made Computing the Soul. Eventually, I had a really strong realization of just how, although my content wasn't bad, there was a lot of swearing in it, and I kind of wanted to be distanced from that community, so I ended up deleting the YouTube channel, or removing the YouTube channel for the most part, specifically because of the swearing. That was one thing. And then the second thing, and this is probably the biggest motivation for me making this video, is that I got a girlfriend. And those who watch the channel, they'll know her as Rain. And that whole experience with the relationship really made me realize just how wrong a lot of the self-improvement YouTubers are about, managing women and about how to make a good relationship. And just, a lot of it is, well, we'll talk about that in a bit. And so I find myself sitting here now. It's been about, I'd say 9 months since we got together. We had a little bit of a break at one point. But I find myself sat here thinking, wow, these people are toxic. They're poisoning people's minds. I kind of low-key knew that. Well, I knew it before, but now I feel particularly powerful about it. So I suppose now I've given the context, maybe a bit of a sort of like a stripped down version. I'm going to start talking about their particular errors and particular solutions to the problems which they kind of have. Like, yeah, they're just kind of gross, a lot of them. Yeah. First and foremost, I think that the biggest indication that there's something wrong in the self-improvement community and in the manosphere and in really most circles online is that everyone in them is unhappy, or almost everyone. Like, I can think of maybe one happy self-improvement YouTuber, and that would be Christopher Lansdowne, and he's not really even a self-improvement YouTuber. He mostly goes after atheists. These people aren't happy. Can you, who spend your time looking around the red pill people, or looking around the manosphere, or looking around other groups, can you think of anybody there who's actually happy? Now, we exist in this world to possess happiness. Maybe not the essential pleasure. In fact, I think that happiness is often directly contrary to sensual pleasure, in a lot of cases, right? We exist in this world to possess happiness in some way, whether it be after death, as I believe, or at least to some extent in this life. None of these people are happy. If these people had the good, if these people had discovered the good through, the acquisition of money, or the acquisition of women, or the acquisition of ego, because a lot of this is ego, why are they, if these things are satisfying and if these people are really improving themselves, why are they miserable? It's not really a question that you can refute. Like, you could say, oh, well, I have this scientific study that says, oh, women are bad, or something like that. Like, we'll deal with that in a second. But, I want to deal with this malaise, and I'm going to give you an example of somebody, I'm not going to name him, but I'm going to give you an example of somebody who I think really fits as a really good example of this. And I'm going to provide you with a solution to that problem, as far as I understand, or as far as I see from what I've read, and from really what I've practiced. So there's this rather large account. I think he's pretty substantial. He was pretty substantial when I was looking at him about a year or two ago. I think it was 2 years ago now. And I think he's still pretty big. I occasionally go and check on his Twitter once in a while. And what he used to do was he would do these big, long Periscope streams where he'd answer questions. And one of the refrains that he would constantly engage in is that he would kind of whine at his audience, to be honest. Like, he'd go like, oh, I keep answering this question for you guys. I keep answering. Why do you idiots keep falling for this? You don't go outside, you just read books, Constantly whining at his audience. And, like, I had some respect for this guy. I used to. I don't so much now. But his content, like, he would sit there and he'd come out with it. And he'd also come out with all kinds of nonsense. But, like, he come out with all kinds of inaccurate nonsense, like, oh, the Christian life isn't realistic in terms of sex. It's like, well, really? Like, how come I'm living it then? How come so many other people have lived it for thousands of years, right? That's an aside. But the thing that really struck me about him is that he wasn't happy. He would come on and he would whine. He would attack his audience that was there for his help. The whole reason that he was on Periscope and on Twitter, like, he would get angry. And you know what it indicates? It indicates that he was habituated into some things that were not conducive to happiness. They weren't conducive to the good. He was an angry person, to put it mildly. And I think this is a problem with a lot of the people on Twitter who do this kind of thing. Now, anger, as it's often called, just like getting, having like that sort of aggressive power, that isn't inherently a bad thing. There is a use for that. And that's for fighting temptations. There's a use for anger. Of course, we wouldn't have it if there wasn't a use. But he applied it in a disordered way. He was getting angry at the people who were paying him and who were relying on his advice. And, the whole purposes of his account, he would just get angry at them. So he was disordering himself by continually, repeatedly getting angry at these people and, engaging in the regular Twitter drama. Now, this naturally leads to unhappiness. If you're constantly harping on the anger thing, you get more and more angry as time goes by. You grow that incentive power, is the wording that is used in one of the books I'm going to recommend later on, which is leading to unhappiness. Now, how do you deal with that? Because you have so many of these people who are angry. Specifically, there are people who are depressed. We're going to talk about the interaction between the depression and the sexual disorder a bit later on. But let's first discuss this anger thing. How could we possibly deal with this problem of anger or resentment? How do I actually deal with the fact that I'm angry at women because a huge majority of them, or that's the view, because a substantial number of them cheat, because a substantial number of them are only interested in money, and this is that I've just said is obviously true. How do I deal with it? Well, the ancient wisdom is that you are generous with them. You have to be generous in order to deal with anger. And this readjusts the will. It changes it from habitually getting angry and bitter to a feeling of, it habituates you towards generosity, which is a virtue. And that will make you happier. The key to this, though, and this is something that I think a lot of them are atheists. I mean, atheism is stupid. Just keep watching the channel to learn why. if you realize that God controls everything because he is providing being to all things, right? When you're generous with people, be it through your own emotions or like your own actions with your own body, or be it through money in your bank account through, I don't know, drop shipping, that's something we're going to get onto a bit later on, you realize that it's not really yours. You got this through happenstance. Of course, you had to work to get it, but your work wasn't guaranteed to bear fruit. It's, happenstance that somebody decided to buy your product. And if you use this for generosity, realizing that it isn't really yours, you're not going to fall into the problem of pride that so many people do. Because there's a certain kind of person, or there's a certain kind of disposition that people might face, where they're giving all of this money for generosity's sake, and that just makes them more prideful, which causes problems. The same problems in a lot of cases. Because if you have a big ego, it's very easy to trample on it, and anger is often a response to being offended in terms of your ego. So, what I would say to people like the one I've just mentioned is if you want to stop getting angry constantly, if you want to stop being miserable, give. You have to give. Even if you don't think you're going to get anything in return. Like, you can't be generous, really, if it's a trade, per se. Like, it has to be something that is completely selfless. But doing that will solve this problem with anger. The second problem that is very obvious, I think, in the manosphere and in self-improvement circles, maybe to lesser or greater extent, depending on the subgroup, is sorrow. There is a habitual sorrow to a lot of people. It's obvious with people like the more incel sort of adjacent people. It's obvious with MGTOWs. Like, they don't deny it. But it's also true for the financial people, and it's also true for the gym people, and it's also true for the POA people. They basically pursue these things as a cope. The person I just mentioned, actually, he tweeted out something that I couldn't possibly disagree with more. And that is that he said that money is your scorecard. He said, how much money you have, that's an indication of where you are in life, And this is something that is often accepted without doubt by many people, including people who aren't even in the PUA thing. Really, a lot of this criticism is just as much of a criticism of modern society per se, as well as, the self-improvement people. The trouble is that really, you don't control the amount of money in your account. I'm sorry to say it, you don't. Because ultimately, you're reliant on a client, be it your boss, or be it the people who buy your Gumroad courses. So what would be the point in ranking what you actually are based on something that you have no possibility of influencing beyond just, standing up and taking swings? It doesn't indicate any particular virtue of a man that he's rich. Like, look at the billionaires that we have in this country. Do we think that they're happy? Do we think that they are satisfied people? No, of course not. We think of them as rich. These millionaires that drive around in fast cars, are they happy? When I look at people in these sorts of very stereotypically what the society would consider blessed kind of situations, are they happy, or what are they doing, or are they just deathing out their problems? Are they throwing money at a problem and expecting it to solve it? Well, it's the latter. They're not actually like that whole idea of money being your scorecard is foolish, and I think it undercuts a lot of it governs a lot of thought in this sort of self-improvement thing. They'll spend hundreds of thousands of hours pouring their money into a pointless side hustle that's making, it could be making a decent amount of money. I'm not against business. But they're doing it not because it actually makes them happy, not because it actually really does anything for them. They could go and work in a 40-hour job and they would be perfectly satisfied. No, they're doing it to distract themselves from their own failings. They'll say, oh, money is your scorecard, and then they will, get angry. They'll get angry at all these, people on the internet. They'll get angry at, their girlfriend. They'll be petrified. They'll live in a state of fear that their girlfriend is going to cheat on them, when they don't really have a basis for this. Now, of course, that is something that I think people who have been raised in divorced households, these are things that, you feel when you've been through that. But instead, maybe of claiming, oh, you're so productive and going after money, you actually address the root of the sorrow. Likewise with just pursuing random women, right? This is a distraction, but it's an understandable distraction, because Saint Thomas Aquinas says, this is one of the people that I read, that pleasure and sorrow are on the same kind of spectrum of feeling, and they're related to what he calls the concupiscible appetite, which is the appetite for those bodily sensitive things. So this can be things like alcohol or food. And so he recommends, when someone is feeling depressed, to have a glass of wine and a hot bath. And so likewise, in a certain sense, people are trying to address their sorrows, which is, the nihilistic worldview of this current age, a fundamentally false one, I might add, but also of their own personal failings. Rather than by actually addressing the problem, by pursuing something that's pleasurable, they're chasing after pleasure. Now, how exactly do you solve it? Well, the problem is very easy. Well, I mean, it's easy to address in the sense of like me saying it right now, but really it's an incredibly difficult problem to solve, because you can say, well, actually self-improve. But there is a very significant problem, and that is the fact that the person who is imperfect can't make themselves perfect in any way, because they need to have what they don't have. And so there needs to be a solution to this, and this consists in, well, what is really called philosophy. What is really the examination of reality and coming to conclusions about it. Christianity has the solution, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as reality is concerned, and that is that classical theism is true, that God is supreme being and provides being to all of those things, and through communication with God, and through communing with God, and through acts of virtue, that is what perfects the soul, not actually our own actions. So that is, as far as I'm concerned, that's the only really sensible solution given reality. I would say that the overwhelming majority of these self-improvement types have just a defective philosophy. They have a defective view on life, and that's why they're angry and sorrowful, because they're not living in accordance with reality. It's as simple as that. The first axe I kind of want to grind at is the Stoics, because there are a lot of people who read Stoic philosophers, and they come to the conclusions that they do. Now, I don't have a problem with some of the writings of the Stoics. In fact, I would tell everyone here who is just kind of sick of these self-improvement types to go and read On the Shortness of Life by Seneca. That's a really, really good text, and you can get through it pretty quickly. But this kind of low-key group of people who insist on this weird detachment of emotions. Like, I remember one of these people saying, "Oh, I'm detached from my girlfriend because I know that she can cheat on me." Like, then why are you in a relationship then? Like, the whole point of a relationship isn't sex. I mean, that is something that, I think, and in fact I know from natural law, should only be limited to relationships. But there's also the bonding part, and you're going to deny the bond? Like, think for a second, you Stoic people. Like, you were born with emotions. Every other part of the human being is intentional. Your hand is used for grasping things. Your mouth, you eat with it. Your nose, you breathe with it, and you smell things, right? And yet your emotions have no purpose, and so you should just cut them off. I think with a lot of these Stoic people, what they're basically trying to do is, again, avoid looking at the existential despair in their life. Like the Daily Stoic or whatever it's called. Like, sure, some Stoic principles, okay, but just majoring on it? No, you're denying a part of what it means to be human. It's a strangulation of one of the things that God has given us that is good. It is a strangulation of a fundamental part of what it means to be human. We are meant to have bonds to things. We are meant to have relationships. We are meant to feel feelings. To suggest otherwise is to suggest that we're somehow like these beings that are intentional in everything else that we do, and are organized bearing that in mind. Like, if we weren't, we'd have the features of lions and stuff like that. We'd have other survival strategies, but as it stands, human beings without weapons are pretty weak. It assumes our intellect and our will to some extent. Not completely. Like there are pre-sentient humans in my view. But it adds quite a bit. And yet we have part of us that doesn't have some sort of value to it. Nonsense. There's a purpose to emotions, and there are positive emotions, and there are emotions that tend towards the good. In fact, there are emotions that can be used to direct us to the good through our proper habituation of our emotions. Of course, I'm not saying here that you need to be a whiny person. Of course, we have far too much of that in our society. We have far too many people who are just whiny people. Of course. And we live around them all the time. But the solution isn't to, completely cut off the emotions. It's to properly order them. That's the first group of people I'd like to deal with. The second group of people are this is largely a PUA thing in my recollection. These people who rely on behaviorism as the means of, living life. They basically view people as these machines where you just sort of, you put in a certain number of parameters and it churns out a result. Trouble is, human beings are not actually machines. We aren't actually mechanical. Our human minds aren't actually in our brain. Sorry, I'll link some papers in the description for proof of this. Human beings are intentional creatures, I'll explain it here. Basically, human beings are intentional creatures, and matter isn't. You don't see. An asteroid doesn't have an intention, it just moves. Something else directs it, that's God. But human beings are unique in the way that we can, overriding our natural impulses, which someone like Aristotle would agree are indeed physical, we can overrule those things and act contrary to them. We can act contrary to reason. We can act contrary to, physical things. And our own minds, the example I'm going to use in the paper that I linked, right? I can think of 1 + 1 = 2, and I know exactly what that thought means. But the actual sounds that I make, someone from Japan is just going to look at me really weird, right? If I draw a triangle on a board, what does it mean? It could be referring to a certain organization. It could, there's an ambiguity in physical things, and yet there's no ambiguity in our minds. We know our minds, and so therefore our minds aren't physical, because everything that is physical has ambiguity. That's another argument. But I'll link the paper. This behavioristic view of human beings, again, doesn't correspond to truth. And so, likewise, that should be cast into the bin, and any assumptions to do with that as well should be cast into the bin. The third one is this over-reliance on scientific studies. Now, the problem with this, which seems rather weird, we live in this time where everything is scientific. We live in this time where there's a substantial number of people who think that the only real way you can come to knowledge is through the scientific method. Of course, this is nonsense, because the scientific method would need then to be proved by itself, which is, kind of putting the cart before the horse, right? But, there's all this stuff backed on scientific data and stuff like this. And I think this is something that's declining in these sorts of manosphere circles, but thank God. But this needs to be considered as well. A lot of the time, these sorts of manosphere people, they don't even read the studies that they're citing for certain things. For example, go and look at some studies. You'll find that long-term, actually, kindness predicts for relationships and not looks. That's one thing, right? But that's not my main point. The bigger problem, and this is something they're probably not aware of, is that since the 1960s, the main problem is in the 1950s. There's been a conflation with the statistical methods that generates the values which the conclusions for these papers are based on. There's been a contradiction in the very mathematical formula that is used to generate the results, generate the p-value rather, for the results that verifies whether or not the alternative hypothesis is actually true. It's called null hypothesis statistical testing. I will link a podcast in the description, but the specific function used for this in biomedical sciences and in psychology especially, right? And other things as well, right? Since about the 1960s, generally speaking, this is like a majority of papers. It's just wrong. It has the contradiction there, and so therefore that nullifies all of the conclusions of these papers. So you're citing all these papers about lookism or hypergamy. I believe in hypergamy anyway, and they're just false, right? They're just null. And most of these papers, I think it's a majority anyway, have been null since the 1960s. So you're building your entire case on papers that are false. Now, what's the alternative to this? Well, we have tradition. We have all of these different wisdom texts, not just in the Bible, not just through there's all manner of different wisdom texts. I'll recommend a few at the end of the video. You have all of these wisdom texts which haven't gone through peer review, as if that would matter, as if peer review is gonna somehow verify a certain book more than thousands of years of constant experience proving it over and over and over again. But you can rely on these things instead, and they say things that are remarkably different to what the Manosphere is saying. So love the wife of your youth. That's one of the things that is said. This is something that should be followed now, just as it was followed then, and it's been proven across. I think love the wife of your youth. I think that was written over. It was definitely written over 2,000 years ago. I can't remember if it was 2,700 or if it was 2,180, 170 years ago. This has been proven throughout times of civilizational decadence, like the one we live in right now. It's been written in times where it's better, in certain respects, and that works. So read those texts instead. Stop relying on the scientism. It's broken for what you're trying to use it for at the moment. The two final, I suppose, life approaches rather than actual philosophies, formally speaking, we're going to be talking about is going to be the pursuit of women and the pursuit of money in a disordered way. So obviously women aren't bad. In fact, by virtue of their existence, in the same way as men, they are good. They are being is good, and they have being, so they're good. They have, of course, disorders because of the fall and because of original sin, but they are still, by their existence, good, in the same way that money is good, and in the same way that men are good. But the problem is that online, when it comes to personal improvement people pursuing women or advising about women, it is basically invariably, maybe not invariably, generally lust. Now, what is lust? By the way, I should probably make it clear. I might be using religious sources, but that doesn't make it any less objective, because religion had to persist in reality. Religion is ultimately shaped by reality, and religion is ultimately, an aspect of reality. It's just, it just is. You can't really, when you know anything about religion, just sort of throw it to the side and say that's the kind of cute thing that the stupid people do. It really doesn't work like that, because there were some extremely intelligent and extremely observant people who put these things together. So I'd recommend you listen. So, lust is the disordered desire for or non-enjoyment of sexual pleasure. Sexual pleasure is morally disordered when sought for itself, isolated from its procreative and unitive purposes. And that's from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is the compilation of 4,000 years nearly of written tradition. 4,000 years, that's roughly 130 generations. A lot of people lived. A lot of people lived to put that knowledge together, and it's cited ridiculously. It goes to, it goes really the extra mile when it comes to citing things like this. So that would be basically, as it says, it would be anything outside of marriage. And of course, many people encourage this. So you say, let's say you don't believe in sin, right? Let me talk about the psychological consequences of it. This was compiled by a guy called Father Chad Ripperger, who is quite big on YouTube for talking about these things. He's actually written a big psychological book. It's not the greatest from what I've heard, but it's pretty comprehensive. And he's relying on a tradition that goes back to, it quotes from St. Thomas Aquinas, who was writing in the 13th century, and St. Alphonsus Liguori, who was writing in the middle of the 18th. And this is, of course, within the 4,000 year tradition I've just mentioned. So this is pretty stern stuff, I think, I'd say. And so let's talk about the 17 psychological consequences of disordered sexual behaviour. Number 1, blindness of intellect. Lust draws our thinking to excess or defect in judging things, and to error in general. Of course, lust is very powerful. I'm sure many of you have seen this. It leads someone to misjudge situations and therefore misact. The second one is the destruction of counsel, which means that it makes us unable to come up with a correct set of steps to reach an end goal, because, as we've just stated, it warps our ability to judge things correctly. The third one is inconsideration. It destroys our judgment for the best means to an end. So, it basically destroys, again, your ability to think. The fourth one is inconstancy. So, inconstancy is basically when, okay, say you want to build a business. You want to make some money. Inconstancy is when you can't stick at it. You might have the right set of steps, you might have the right situations, you might know the right people, but you just can't, set down pleasure long enough to actually do it. I'm sure many of you find yourself in that state if you are living a life of lust. You're just kind of destroyed when it comes to doing actual work, and you're also destroyed when it comes to actually thinking. The fifth one is a disordered love of self, otherwise known as pride. I'm sure that I don't need to give an example. Any examples of people who are like this. I think that everyone's met people like this. I feel like the culture is kind of just suffocating under this influence. The sixth is the hatred of God. So God sets his commandments, tells you not to engage in these things, and I'm sure people watching this might be feeling this now. He says, oh, you shouldn't satisfy these things, so you get angry and begin to hate God. Of course you shouldn't, because God is trying to actually direct you to your real good, but this is a consequence. The seventh is the love of the present life. There's a disregarding of the immortality of the soul, which we spoke about earlier on, and proved, and hence there's a fixation in the here and now without real long-term thinking. This is why a lot of people tend to indulge in the gym, right? They're thinking about their body, in a lot of cases, for the sake of vanity. Like, if you sit and think about it, I bet a lot of you go to the gym purely for vanity or for, fulfilling this end that we're discussing here. Of course, exercising in itself isn't bad, but the vanity is the bad thing. That is a manifestation of this in some cases. For those who believe in heaven and hell, and I think even for those who don't, there's a despair of the future life. People don't think that they can be saved. There's all kinds of people who say, oh, God hates me, or like God doesn't think of me as good because I've done all these sins. It's like, well, God is love. Why would he be different for you? Perhaps a little harsh there, but yeah, I mean that's basically the truth. He still loves you, even if you don't believe in him. Incircumspection, where people cannot track their own circumstances, so they don't know how to act properly in their current state. So people losing track of themselves, and they do stupid things. Number 10 is gluttony. So it turns out that lust and gluttony are under the same appetite. And so if you can't control yourself in these matters, then you won't be able to control yourself with food. I have a feeling, I think that people are probably getting their cogs turning a little bit here. Number 11 is the lack of fortitude. Like we said with the inconstancy, you can't stay the course of things. You are less able to control suffering. You aren't able to, suffer as much, basically. Number 12 is effeminacy. The unwillingness to set down what is pleasurable for what is hard but good, or, obviously better. That's something we've talked about at length, I think. Number 13 is the destruction of modesty. So when I mean modesty, I don't mean like this Victorian idea of, just kind of going a bit over the, maybe not over the top for the time, but, like just dress. It's about regulation of exterior actions in relation to humility. When people don't have modesty, they behave very arrogantly in their exterior actions, right? So you can have a woman who is dressed the most modestly you can imagine, and they will be highly, 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 highly arrogant. And I'm sure people have met them. Those people, they lack modesty. Number 14 is pride, or self-esteem, which is the destruction of humility and consequently all virtue. Number 15 is something called scurrility. People become unable to control external actions sexually. I'm sure that many of you know this. It's like a lack of decorum. Number 16 is antisocial behaviour. I'm sure that many people are aware that revolutions would result from the fact that people despise the law of God. But they also despise the laws of the state if they are in relation to this. And of course, we can look through history and see this. We can see it in the 1960s. We can see it in many other places. This is something that's been a continuous trend for 200 years, I'd say. And then the final one is death, because it leads to dangerous behavior and the mixing in of different other passions. This could be death of the person or death of other people. Again, I'm sure I don't need to tell you examples. In fact, I can think of one, Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is a good example. So that is why you should not engage in disordered sexual behavior. I kind of read the list. I had this list from a previous video and I thought I'd share it with you here. So now we've talked about that, and now you're probably, with any luck, either you should be terrified and you should stop, or you might be angry and typing a comment. Who knows? Second one is, this inordinate pursuit of money. You don't actually need that money, though, do you? Why are you pursuing this money beyond what you need? What's the point? So you can live in luxury? Well, you fall into a similar category to the ones I've just discussed. If you're doing it for ego, then again, ego blinds. You don't need all this money. Of course, pursuing money is a good reason, is a good thing, rather, insofar as it is for what is necessary. Like, there's nothing wrong with pursuing a higher level of business so you can pay for your children. But just doing it for its own sake is the root of all evil, St. Paul says, and I think we can see this from, just through history again. But more important than that, I'd like those people who are, watching, I'd like to invite you to a meditation. Now imagine you're on your deathbed, and all you have are the people who wanted your money and your money. How do you feel? Are you going to be able to use that money for anything, or is it going to go to someone else? Have you just heaped together all of that wealth for someone else to spend it? It seems a bit kind of a waste of time, doesn't it? Now, in that perspective, have you thought... In fact, this is just the general message of the video. Self-improvement people, have you thought about what it is like to die? Do you think that your self-improvement will help you there? No. Now, many of you will obviously think atheist things. They'll think, oh, God doesn't exist, I'll just live my life and then I'll be in the ground. Well, I mean, not true, sorry. I have a lot of my channels related to that. I'll do subsequent videos on this as well if people want. But yeah, it's just not true. It's like, even if you're going to say, oh, religion, I mean, you have Aristotle saying the same thing. You have Plato, although he has some weird ideas, pointing out the immortality of the soul as well. Like, this isn't controversial, and it was the majority view throughout all of history, right? And it's just straight up true. You can read the things in the description. So I'm going to close up this video. It's rather long now, with a set of recommendations for people who are in the self-improvement sphere to read, and so that they can, develop in actual self-improvement rather than this mucking around. So as I said I would, I'm going to provide some book recommendations. Now the first one, which I don't actually have a physical copy of in front of me, I listened through it a few years ago, is On the Shortness of Life by Seneca. It's really, really good, and I think it's going to remind you that maybe if you're engaging in the wrong kind of self-improvement, you might be wasting your time. Something always to acknowledge. Second thing I would recommend is maybe after reading, Last Superstition by Edward Fazer. It goes over the modern scientific materialist views and obliterates them. This should probably be required reading if you're an atheist. After that, there is The Three Ages of the Interior Life by Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. And there's 2 volumes to this. I don't know which volume this is. But basically, it goes through a whole philosophical and theological understanding of how to run your life, basically. How to live the good life. And there's even a chapter which goes over whether or not you're pursuing wisdom, or whether or not you're trying to be, just kind of, overemphasizing fortitude, and what the true end of life actually is, which is charity. Really good. I use this. This is really, really good. I've used this extensively. The third one is a book that I haven't actually read. My girlfriend has read it, and she seems to have really, really high regard for it. And just looking over some of it, like I've got a bookmark in there, I've read bits of it. But looking over it, I think it would be ideal for PUAs, and that is Love and Responsibility by Saint Pope John Paul II. His name here is Karol Wojtyła. Really good book on how to properly approach relationships, how to properly understand them, and yeah, give it a read. So we've already gone through a couple of spiritual books. Well, the spiritual book that I've just gone through is The Three Ages. In terms of practical ones, I don't have one of them in front of me, but actually, yes, I do. It's under all of that stuff. But I would recommend, there is a book called Saint Teresa of Lisieux's Story of a Soul. It's about a nun in 19th, early 20th century France, and I don't think it's really going to appeal to a lot of self-improvement people immediately, but it's an extremely sweet work. It's very, very sweet. It might not appeal, because, being habituated into anger constantly, it's not necessarily going to. But when I read it, or when I listened through it, much of it anyway, a few years back, I remember just thinking, wow, that's incredibly sweet. It's very beautiful. And I'd also recommend John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila on top of that. Another one I'd recommend, and this is something I've used quite a lot, although I don't think is perfect, is the Philokalia, which is a collection of Eastern Christian spiritual works. So this is on things from prayer through to, keeping control of thoughts. There's a Catholic priest called Father David Abernathy, who calls them basically the world's first depth psychologists. And it's a fascinating work. It's often, like I say, a little bit strange, like it doesn't tolerate sensual pleasure at all, which seems contrary to my kind of scholastic sensibilities, but it's nonetheless there. I'd recommend reading it. If you're going to read it, I'd recommend reading. There's orders for reading it online. There's one from a book called The Way of the Pilgrim, which is used by one of the Eastern Orthodox bishops who translated this, called Callistos Ware. It's also recommended, in other places. I think Father David Abernathy recommends it as well. Good work. Take it with a pinch of salt. And I was thinking of recommending the Catechism, but frankly, I think that, if you read through the last superstition, then come to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. But this is basically a very big, very underrated theological manual, and this will also help structure your life. There's a bit on prayer, which is something which everyone needs to do. Like I don't you need to do it if you're Catholic, and if you're, it's a necessary part of human natural existence, but it should be directed to God. This will help you with that. It will help you properly organize yourself morally. It'll just, it's a great book. And of course, I don't think I need to mention the Bible. Read it with commentary, though. Always read it with commentary. There's the Haydock, which is good, and you can get patristic commentaries through a place called newadvent.com. So, very long video. Maybe not the most structured, not structured like I usually do, but hopefully you found this useful. I'm expecting criticism in the comments. I'm also expecting, maybe not expecting, that's a really harsh word. I'd also really appreciate if you could share this through word of mouth. I'd especially like to hear from self-improvement YouTubers who've watched this and thought about it. And, dependent on actual criticisms, I'll respond to them maybe in subsequent videos. So, thanks a lot for watching. A little bit unstructured. I don't actually have a script for this one. But, hopefully it was useful. Thank you. And I'll see you later. Bye-bye.